Okay, quiet please. All set?
Yep.
Okay, go ahead. Bienvenido, welcome, Mr. Cardenas from Mexico. Washington State is quite a ways from Mexico. What brings you to Washington State today?
Well, I'm here invited by the Rainbow Coalition, and well, it's not the first time I'm here. I've been twice in the Yakima Valley visiting our Mexican compatriots that are working there, and I've been here at the university and with our friends from El Centro La Raza and the Rainbow Coalition also for several times.
The population here in Washington State since 1979 has increased by 80%. This population, mostly Mexican, is the largest minority group in the state of Washington. Many of the people are agricultural workers from Mexico, some of them from your very state of Michoacan.
Michoacan, yes.
Yes. What are some of your feelings and thoughts about that?
Well, they come here because we haven't been able in Mexico to provide jobs for everybody, to assure a good living standard, and that's the main reason why people continue migrating from Mexico, and I think this will even increase because of the policies that have been or are being implemented in Mexico, the changes in our agrarian laws that will probably increase the migration of Mexicans to the United States, and we even estimate that maybe 1 million families, that's 4 or 5 million people, will be coming to the States in the very next years.
I've talked with a lot of people about the increase in this population, and people don't seem to be as aware as maybe they should. Is that what you're experiencing? Is that your understanding, maybe in states like California, Oregon, and Washington State?
Well, maybe some people don't realize the importance of the Mexican population or the Latin American population, or the increase of this migration currents that have been coming here to this part of the United States. But I am sure that many groups, many social groups, many people interested in the social and economic situation of this country are very well aware of the presence of Mexicans and the increasing presence of Mexicans in this part of the country.
Well, your visit definitely promotes goodwill, but it also promotes a discussion about something that is very important to you and the Mexican people, the Canadians as well, is this what is called a free trade agreement. Many people might not know about the free trade agreement. What is the free trade agreement, sir?
Well, the free trade agreement for us, for Mexicans, is the putting into practice this enterprise for the Americas announced by President Bush about 2 years ago, or maybe a little more. And that means for us that the present situation of decreasing living standards, decreasing wages, will continue in Mexico. We think that this situation will consolidate through the signature of the free trade agreement, because what the Mexican government has been offering is and presenting as the main comparative advantage of Mexico is low wages, the possibility of providing labor for different activities here in the United States, mainly for agriculture. And we think that this agreement, this economic and commercial agreement with the United States, should open possibilities for improving our living standards, for promoting the creation of jobs, mainly because we have a very high unemployment in Mexico after the opening of our markets, opening our markets in exchange of nothing, opening them in a very restricted way, and not considering its economic and social effects. So we are very concerned about this trade agreement, and that's why we in our party, the Party of the Democratic Revolution, have proposed a different kind of agreement, a continental pact of development and trade, in which the 3 countries Mexico, Canada, and the United States, should recognize their differences in living standards, in the productivity of their economies, the existing differences between the three countries, and decide to decrease or lower these differences, to eradicate these differences, and to improve the general conditions in the three countries. So then, after having a better condition in the three countries, there could be a real competitiveness in their trade and in their economic exchanges.
Sir, in order to keep this localized here in Washington State or even in Seattle, Washington, what might be some of the ways that the free trade agreement, as it's being talked about now, how might that affect or impact this particular area of the country, the Northwest?
Well, I think in general that one of the impacts will be that jobs that could be created in the States will be created in Mexico. But those are low-wage jobs. And I think that one thing that of what you should be aware of is that this association, this agreement between the States and Mexico is an association with a low-wage economy. And that will surely impact wages in a general way in the United States. Another thing that you will be noticing or feeling in the near future is the increase of Mexicans coming here to the United States and competing for jobs and competing for everything. So that's why we think that if the real objective of this agreement were the improvement of social conditions, then we should start thinking of investments directed in Mexico to improve social conditions, to create jobs, to have a more rational development of our economy, and at the same time consider the possible effects of those investments in the United States, so the negative effects could be in one way or another handled with.
A couple of the things that you talk about in your statement called the Continental and Trade Initiative, you talk about a couple of concepts called social mobility and a social charter, or rather the movement of labor. The movement of labor and a social charter. What are these concepts about?
Well, you must remember that one issue that is not being discussed in the negotiations on the free trade agreement is precisely migration or labor mobility. We think that this should be taken into consideration because labor is the most important exchange between Mexico and the United States. It's the most important exchange from an economic point of view, from a social point of view, from any point of view you consider, it's the most important. If you consider that only in this part of the country, in the Pacific coast of the country, there are maybe 6-7 million Mexicans or people of Mexican origin, and they generate, let's think of something around $100 billion in wages yearly. That's 3 times the U.S. exports to Mexico. So this, only considering this from an economic point of view, this should be taken into consideration. We know that there are problems, and we know that giving a good solution to this problem will not be a one-step solution, and it will take time. But we should at least start talking of this problem, and we should at least start thinking on how many steps, how many stages we can solve this problem, so we can stop the migration from Mexico to the United States, but creating other conditions in Mexico, offering jobs, increasing the living standards in Mexico, and that would be, I think, the most effective factor to reduce migration from Mexico to the United States.
Am I hearing you say, though, that at the same time there's a possibility that Mexicans would be coming all the way up the coast and possibly taking jobs in Canada?
Well, they're doing so. They cross the border several thousands of people every day. Well, they start in California, but you have here maybe 150,000 Mexicans, mainly in the Yakima Valley. You have many Mexicans, thousands of Mexicans in Oregon. And I think that some Mexicans, very few by now, are already in Alaska. So they will be coming more and more to all the Pacific coast.
How will your negotiations with Canada be different, or how are they different than negotiations with the United States? Do you want the same thing for the Mexican coming to this country and working here? Do you want the same thing for them in Canada as well as the United States?
Well, one thing I should tell you is that the Mexican government gives no information on how negotiations on the free trade are going on. So we know more from American sources than from Mexican sources, and we really don't know what negotiations are being carried on with the United States and what negotiations with Canada. But yes, we would like that, considering a social charter, that a social charter should start in each country. Each country should establish its own social standards. But we would like that Mexicans coming here would find good, fair labor conditions, fair wages, that they could be paid the same as American workers if they're doing the same kind of jobs, that they could have the possibility of improving their working skills, that they could have social security, be socially protected, the worker and their families. And I think that if there are social standards in the three countries, we should aim to the higher standards and not going to the lower standards when this agreement comes into practice.
Okay, as a viewer, watching right now, I might say, well, why should we provide, social services for these people coming into this country? I mean, who's going to pay for that?
Well, if the people come here to work and they're contributing to the progress of this country, well, there should be some compensation. And if you open this possibility to Mexicans or to people from any other country, and if you're talking of a democratic system in the United States, I think you should consider that anybody working here in the States should have the same working conditions as any American citizen working here in the United States. On the other hand, because if you have an association with a low-wage economy, if you have an association with a country where living standards are decreasing more and more, well, you will have in the near future a situation of instability in your southern border. And, well, we don't want that. That's why we're really struggling politically to change conditions in Mexico. But I think that wouldn't be convenient, not for the United States.
But doesn't that pose a tremendous problem in terms of the amount of labor that's going to be moving across the border? What kinds of changes will have to take place in immigration law in the event that the free trade...
I don't know what will happen with immigration law, because immigration is not being discussed by the negotiators of the free trade agreement.
And why is that?
Well, that was a decision taken by the American government not to discuss migration problems, or this, not to discuss this issue. But I think that if we want a stronger market in Mexico, if we want to have more capacity in our in purchasing power in Mexican society, well, we'll have to try seriously to improve economic and social conditions in Mexico. If not, you will be associating with a low-wage economy and with markets that will be reducing its possibility and the possibility they offer to American productions and to productions from Mexico or from any other place.
How many jobs, do you have a rough estimate as to how many jobs will be created by a free trade agreement?
what I could tell you is that Mexico began opening its trade in 1982. And what has happened is that Mexico has lost thousands or millions of jobs. We had in 1982 about 1.5 million of unemployed. Now we have 9 million unemployed. That's almost a third of our labor force. And this is the trend that continues. In Mexico, several thousands, maybe 70,000 companies have gone broke or have closed in this last decade. And that's what's been happening. What's been improving is American exports to Mexico. What has increased in Mexico is the exports we receive from the United States. They increased in the last 3 or 4 years from 12 billion to almost $40 billion. And that's the most important attraction, what makes more attractive the free trade agreement for this country.
Might there be the possibility that jobs will be created in Mexico where people from this country will be going, to Mexico to work in various capacities? Will jobs be created there for North Americans?
Yes, there are some areas where jobs will be created in those activities that produce for exports, in certain services. If with the free trade agreement, some services will be open, the possibility of going to Mexico, like banking or insurance or engineering. Well, there will be jobs for some Americans there too.
And in turn, now, people coming then to the United States to work, say people coming to Washington State to work from Mexico after the free trade agreement, we're going to see a different type of worker than we've seen in the past. Mostly it's people coming to this state who are agricultural workers, but it seems like the workforce that comes to this country will be much more diverse, would it not?
No, because if labor mobility is not considered in the agreement, you will continue seeing here only those that come mostly undocumented to work mainly in agriculture.
Sir, what is the role of the Mexican-born...
So you want to stop here for just
okay.
a second. All set?
Everybody?
Okay.
What role do you see the U.S.-born Mexican playing in all of this?
Well, I think that they can influence your political decisions in this country, so we could arrive to a much more fair agreement between the two countries, where the main objective would be to improve social conditions in both countries and establish a quite different economic relationship between the two countries.
At this point, how do you see the negotiations, the talks, the discussions regarding the free trade agreement? How are they progressing? Satisfactorily in your estimation?
Well, as I told you before, we really don't know because the Mexican government doesn't give any information. They even say, the representative of the Trade Commission in the Senate recently said that it's better not to give information so there are no obstacles for the negotiations. So they keep information away from the public, and we really don't know where the negotiations are at this moment. We know that they are negotiating. We know there are some difficulties here and some difficulties there, but we really don't know where the negotiations are standing right now.
Well, what are the major concerns of the Mexican people that you talk to regarding all of this free trade agreement in terms of its ratification?
Well, what we're concerned about is that what will happen after the trade agreement is signed is that the present situation will consolidate. And that means that Mexico will continue having low wages and lowering wages, that we won't have a balanced economic development. Our economy has been developing in a very distorted way. those activities that export have been growing. They have been developing. There is investment in those activities, but on other activities other activities are almost disappearing, like consumers goods industries or agriculture. Agriculture is living a real disaster at this moment in general, and only those areas where you obtain crops for export, they're attended, they're well kept, they're receiving attention from the government or from investors. But the rest is living a real disaster, social and economic.
You're the son of a former president of Mexico. You also ran for the presidency of Mexico in 1988. If you should decide to run in 1994, what do you think would be your differences with the current Mexican administration's policy on immigration and workers coming to this country?
Well, first, this will be a decision taken by our party maybe by mid-1993, not now. There would be big differences. We are concerned mainly about the social conditions of Mexicans in Mexico and Mexicans here in the United States. And we believe that the present administration pays no attention to social conditions, education, wages, health of Mexicans here or in any other, here or in Mexico. And my personal decision of running will be taken after our party calls for the registration of candidates when time comes. But if Carlos Salinas decided to reform our constitution and try re-election, then I would say yes at this moment. I would be running.
Whether there's a free trade agreement or not, there's still going to be a movement of labor, primarily agricultural labor, coming to this state of Washington. What would you say to the people who are watching us now? What would you say to them regarding those workers?
Well, in the first place, that we are very much concerned about their conditions here in the States and their conditions in Mexico and their families' conditions in Mexico. We think that the economic policies in our country should be designed around objectives of improving social conditions, of offering the possibility of jobs for every Mexican, offering the possibility of the education for every child and every for the young people in Mexico, and that we would be trying very hard to change the present conditions in Mexico so that Mexicans wouldn't be forced anymore to leave our country looking for better possibilities in other parts of the world, like here in the United States. We have been demanding the possibility of Mexicans Mexican citizens that live abroad outside of our country, that they could vote. They cannot vote at this moment. We think that this is a right. They should have the possibility of practicing, of exerting, and that I would tell them that we're on the same cause, that we are trying to improve living conditions in Mexico. We're trying to really promote progress in balanced development in Mexico, and I think that we think very much alike, Mexicans here and we of the Party of the Democratic Revolution in Mexico.
Muchas gracias.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much.
Great, thank you.